Contrasting welcomes for Israel's Prime Minister in the US, divisions over the war in Gaza on show with protests outside a cheering Congress. In a week of dramatic politics in Washington, how is Benjamin Netanyahu's visit being viewed there and back in Israel? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami, Zeidan. US politicians gave Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu a welcome he's not likely to get anywhere else, particularly back home. You see, despite a boycott by some Democrats, Congress roared and cheered his speech. US media fact-checkers, though, well, they said it wasn't entirely all accurate, shall we say, when it came to things like the number of civilians killed and injured, the delivery of aid, and so on. Well, during his trip, Netanyahu met the current and previous US presidents, as well as the woman who hopes to be the next one. American weapons and funding have been central to Israel's war on Gaza, which has killed almost 40,000 Palestinians. Did the visit signal any meaningful shift in US bipartisan political support for Israel? Did Netanyahu get what he wanted from the trip? And how's it gone down in Israel? We'll discuss all of that with our guest shortly. But first, this report from Sharif.
A defiant speech met with applause, but also boycotts and protests. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint sitting of the US Congress on Wednesday, promising total victory against Hamas in Gaza.
The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza.
He went on to emphasize the long-standing and close relations between the US and Israel.
My friends, if you remember one thing from the speech, remember this: our enemies are your enemies. Our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory.
But his speech exposed sharp divisions, with dozens of Democratic senators skipping it and applauding Republicans packing one side of the chamber. Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American serving in Congress, held up two signs, one saying war criminal and the other guilty of genocide. During the nearly hour-long address, thousands gathered outside to condemn Israel's war on Gaza and the resultant humanitarian crisis. Later, Netanyahu met US President Joe Biden, who pressed for a Gaza ceasefire deal that includes the release of captives held by Hamas. Vice President and presumptive Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris struck a tougher note, signaling a possible shift in US policy.
What has happened in Gaza over the past 9 months is devastating. The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
Netanyahu ended his week-long visit by meeting Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump, who's repeatedly urged Israel to finish the job and destroy Hamas. The former US president also criticized Harris for her stance on Gaza.
I think her remarks were disrespectful. They weren't very nice, pertaining to Israel. I actually don't know how a person who's Jewish can vote for her.
Netanyahu's US trip was the first abroad since the war began in October. The Israeli bombing has killed nearly 40,000 Palestinians, prompting protests from university campuses to Capitol Hill. Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and an international advisor to the advocacy organization Jewish Voice for Peace. In Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy, a columnist for the Israeli daily Haaretz and author of The Punishment of Gaza. And also in Washington, D.C., Niall Stanage, a political analyst and the White House columnist for the political newspaper The Hill. Thanks to all of you for joining us. If I could start with Niall. So, has Netanyahu's visit demonstrated, Niall, do you think, that support for Israel is no longer a solidly bipartisan affair?
Oh, yes, it has certainly demonstrated that. I mean, the boycott by Democratic members of his speech to Congress was very significant. It encompassed a lot of Democrats, not only people on the so-called hard left of the party. In addition to that, you had the protests in the streets, which underlined, I think, the degree of public discontent with Israel's assault on Gaza. I mean, this is an issue where the voter base of the Democratic Party now, by a significant margin, sympathizes more with the broad Palestinian side in this conflict than with the Israeli side. That is clearly a shift. We don't want to exaggerate this. The American public overall is still split. Republican voters are still overwhelmingly pro-Israel. But the idea that there was bipartisan unity in the idea of standing with Israel, that's now gone.
Interesting. Phyllis, what does this tell us about the degree of influence that organizations like AIPAC have in today's America and today's American political scene then?
Well, I think what we've been seeing for quite some time, Sami, is that AIPAC, which continues to be a very wealthy organization, a very key part of the pro-Israel lobby. It's not the only part. There's Christians United for Israel. There's a host of other organizations. But AIPAC is a leading force, and it remains so. It has the money to, for example, put $20 million into the campaign of one of the members of Congress, Jamal Bowman, in New York, to make sure that he was defeated. And that massive investment succeeded. But it took that kind of an investment, the highest by far of any congressional race in this country's history. So the influence of AIPAC is certainly diminishing, and particularly what we just heard about the demise of the bipartisan nature of this consensus is certainly on the way. But I think it's very important to put that in the context of the divide between the electeds of the Democratic Party and the base of the Democratic Party. The base of the Democratic Party and the base, in fact, of the people of this country as a whole, as Niall just said, is shifting very much towards the question of Palestinian rights and towards criticizing Israel and a call to stop sending military support. And in that context, this consistency of policy has not changed. We saw it again with Kamala Harris. I assume we'll get to that later. But with President Biden as well, shifts in language are responding to the pressure of our movements. We are not yet seeing a shift in the actual policy.
Right.
The policy of sending all the weapons they want.
We definitely want to get into that, but that was a very important distinction you made between the electeds and the base. We'll see if we can pick into that too. But before we go down there, let me ask Gideon in Tel Aviv this question. Whatever can be said about the divisions that this trip unveiled, did Netanyahu get ultimately what he wanted out of this trip? Rubbing shoulders with key politicians, a red carpet and cheers in Congress, over 50 standing ovations, I think.
He couldn't ask for more. And it was, Sami, if you let me say so, the most shameful moment of the American Congress. I mean, except of those who were not there, cheering so many times, standing ovation for what? Not mentioning even once the killing of Gaza, the children of Gaza, the victims of Gaza, nothing. And, you know, he is a very, very polished speaker, especially in English, but not one of the sentences that he said was connected to reality. And not one word he said, he really meant it. What is his vision for Gaza? What is this talking about Israel protecting the United States? And the most amazing thing was to watch those puppets, sorry for the harsh language, those puppets in the Congress, in the Senate, standing up again and again and cheering without them even having the slightest idea what are they cheering for God's sake. For someone who is wanted or will be very soon be wanted by the International Court of the International Criminal Court, someone who is at least suspected in major criminal crimes of war. But coming back to your question, yes, he achieved what he wanted.
Gideon, does that help him out at all? We know that the polls don't show he has a very good standing right now. I think a majority of Israelis want him out of power. Does any of the, the reception that he got in the US change any of that?
I think so. Finally, it's really fueled his fans with more energy, because to see a prime minister who is the fourth time, the only statesman who had been so many times in the Congress and spoke to the Congress, and again his polished English and speech and the standing ovations. I mean, nobody remained indifferent to this in Israel, and he went there for domestic reasons, and he achieved some domestic points by those events.
Well, he's got some domestic points in Israel. But Phyllis, how do Jewish Americans view Netanyahu's trip and his positioning of Israel and himself as kind of the representative and defender of Jewish people?
Well, there has been an enormous shift in Jewish public opinion in this country for the last 10 years or so. But the last months, the months of the assault that has become genocide in Gaza, has led to a drastic escalation in this shift. We were seeing less than 3 years ago, a poll of American Jews that indicated 25% of American Jews, this is in 2021, believe that Israel is an apartheid state. 38% of young Jews, and that generational shift is a key component. What we saw this week during Netanyahu's visit, 400 Jewish activists, mainly from Jewish Voice for Peace, with about 2 or 3 dozen rabbis in the center and surrounded by Jews wearing bright red T-shirts that said on one side, Jews say no arms to Israel, and the other side said not in our name, being arrested in Congress, in one of the congressional buildings, being taken out one by one. They didn't get out till 4 o'clock in the morning the next day. To say that Jews are standing against Netanyahu and against what Israel stands for, because Netanyahu is not some isolated, he is not popular for sure personally, but he is hardly an outlier within the Israeli political reality. The next day in the protest outside, I was in a contingent of labor people and Jewish people, and it was enormous within a multiple thousands of protesters outside. So the change there is an extraordinary level. We're seeing it in terms of how young Jews are growing up with choices about what Jewish identity means. What we might call the justice generation, who came of age politically in the summer of 2020 in the protests over the killing of George Floyd and the whole question of how fundamental racism is in the United States, are now seeing their relationship to Israel and their relationship to Palestinians in the context of a social justice and racial justice issue, and not as part of necessary Jewish identity, the way it was when I grew up as a young kid. It's very different.
A bit of a reframing going on. I want to come back to the point which Phyllis mentioned about the divisions within the Democratic camp. It might be useful to shed some light. Let's listen into some of the different things being said by different members of the Democratic Party.
I don't think that it is productive right now whatsoever for Netanyahu to be addressing Congress. I see not only is there very little purpose to it, but I think it is patently unproductive. I think it's counterproductive right now.
Tomorrow will be unique in bringing Prime Minister Netanyahu to address a joint meeting of Congress. It will be the first time in American history that a war criminal has been given that honor. Frankly, this invitation to Netanyahu is a disgrace and something that we will look back on with regret.
So counterproductive, a war criminal. That's the sentiment on one side, shall we say, of the Democratic camp. On the other hand, here are some statements from other members of congressmen who also are from the Democratic Party, and what they had to say a bit different. Peter Aguilar from San Bernardino saying, "I feel when world leaders come to the People's Chamber, it's important that we hear their perspective. Israel is our closest ally." Also a statement by US Representative Brad Sherman, a Democrat from California, saying, addressing the question of whether people should be boycotting Netanyahu's speech, he said, "Well, I think it's a mistake. I mean, we haven't had a world leader come here I didn't have some disagreements with." So keeping all of that in mind, Niall, has the visit also highlighted some deep divisions, not only between the base and the elected officials, as Phyllis analysed beautifully for us, but also within the elected officials themselves now?
Well, it has. And Phyllis made a great point, or really two great points that I want to expand on a little bit. One is this gap between the elected officials and the base of the Democratic Party. And the other, which is a really vital distinction, is the age or generational issue. That is one of the, if not the single biggest schism in the American public right now when it comes to the broad view of Israel and the Palestinians generally. Now, on the elected officials point, I think it is worth emphasizing that you played there Senator Sanders, who's technically an independent, and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, who are both very much seen as on the left of the Democratic Party. The interesting thing about this debate is it is those voices from the left that are actually more in tune with the body of Democratic voters outside of Congress. And it is those more pro-Israel voters you quoted, including Congressman Sherman, who are actually out of step with their own party voters. As I say, there's a different argument to be made.
What does that tell us, Niall? That's a very good connection that you've made there. What does that tell us, and what does that mean for the future of the Democratic camp?
I think what it means is that I would assume over decades, or that's certainly years, the Democratic Party will move in a more sympathetic to Palestine direction. And I think that that is where the future is leading. And it's not just me saying that or people who hold the views that Phyllis holds saying that. There was a recording infamously maybe a year or so ago where I believe it was the director of AIPAC or someone in AIPAC was expressing concern that they don't have a political problem, they have an age problem, because young people are so much more likely to be critical of Israeli policy and so much more likely to take seriously the Palestinian aspiration for self-determination.
Interesting. Since we're talking about division. Yeah, go ahead, sorry. Phyllis.
I think that I agree with what Niall has just said, but I think it's really important to recognize that none of this happens accidentally or inevitably. It will only happen if the extraordinary movement for Palestinian rights that has been so much on the rise in recent years and is now so much more powerful, so much closer to power than it ever has been before, maintains its power and its strength in the streets, in the lobbying, in the uncommitted movement, in the protest from people working inside the administration. All of those factors have to continue, because what we have seen is that so far we've been able to change the language of President Biden, of Vice President Harris, who's now, of course, the leading candidate, but we have not seen a change in policy. When President Biden said on the day that the 7 humanitarians from the World Central Kitchen, who happened to be, for the first time, only one of the 7 was Palestinian. The other 6 were internationals, which was not accidental in his singling them out. When he said, "My heart is breaking," I have no doubt that's probably true, but it's profoundly irrelevant whether he is heartbroken or not, because 4 hours later, he authorized a new shipment of bombs to be used on the children of Gaza. And as long as the change stays at the level of the language, that's not good enough. So
Right.
we have to be very clear that the kind of change that Niall is talking about will only happen if this movement stays strong and mobilized.
All right, talking about divisions and change, let's take it to Tel Aviv. Gideon, there are divisions in Israel over policy, over accepting a permanent ceasefire deal, right? How might they be impacted by what just happened with the Netanyahu visit to Washington, with the perceived support that he got from powerful figures, from Congress? You know, there are reports on the one hand that there is something of a security consensus within Israel right now to go for a deal. But we heard it from Netanyahu in Washington. We heard it repeated several times from him from June the 1st, the day after Biden, the US president, unveiled his latest peace proposal, saying, hey, the war's going to go on till we destroy Hamas. We're not going to stop.
Sami, don't be wrong. There is an opposition in Israel to Netanyahu. There is a big protest in favor of releasing the hostages, but there is no opposition in Israel, or no meaningful opposition in Israel, to continuing the war. There is no meaningful opposition to continue the occupation. There is no meaningful alternative to the current apartheid policy. And this must be remembered, because many people watch those demonstrations, which are very impressive, week after week, day after day, and they are sure that Israel is going to change. Take my word, even if Netanyahu will be replaced, we will face basically the same policy. Don't have any illusions about it. And from this point of view, it doesn't matter if Netanyahu will remain another year or not. There are many other aspects in which Netanyahu must go. Many other aspects. Occupation, apartheid, and continuing the war are not among those things that will be changed by this. And I would like just to refer one more sentence about what Phyllis had just said. I was watching yesterday the Olympic Games, the ceremony, I guess all of you did, the opening of the Olympic Games. And there is one state, only one state, which is excluded, and this is Russia. And why Russia is excluded? Because it invaded Ukraine. It took few weeks for the world to put sanctions on Russia. And here we are watching now the most important sport event in the world, and Russia is not there. Why is Israel there?
All right. I want to bring the question to the point which Phyllis opened earlier about policy. Did we see Netanyahu's visit wade into some policy and some very real political divisions within America that is not always standard when a foreign leader comes to visit the US, right? And I'm talking about things like the image of him sitting next to Donald Trump while Donald Trump was criticizing Kamala Harris. The fact that he attacked some American protesters in his speech to Congress while at the same time endorsing the fraternity brothers. To the statement by one of his ministers supporting Donald Trump's candidacy for the White House just before Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went off to meet President Biden and Kamala Harris.
Yes, I mean, all these things are unusual for a foreign leader, if we use that term generically. The complexity is they aren't at all unusual for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, of course, came here more than a decade ago, while then President Obama was in the midst of trying to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran. Netanyahu came here to basically lambaste that effort and to very much align himself with the Republican side. I don't think, if we're just speaking frankly, that there's really any question that Netanyahu would prefer Mr. Trump to be elected in November. There are some people here who certainly think that Netanyahu's unspoken strategy is to keep the war going in the hope that Trump will be elected and he will have even greater impunity or even wider impunity than he has done under President Biden. So it is incongruous for foreign leaders generally. It is very consistent with Mr. Netanyahu's rather ruthless and often rather, in my view, cynical way of exercising political power and influence.
Phyllis, what real signals came out of this trip by Netanyahu to the US about what the real actual policies might be of each of the presidential candidates should they make it to the White House? I mean, on the one hand, we have Donald Trump boasts of his support for Israel, but he's also been talking about how Israel has to get the job done quickly when it comes to Gaza and finish this. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, well, she's spoken about ending the war, but as vice president, she's part of an administration, as you pointed out, that's continued to support and arm Israel, even as the world's top courts have issued warrants, or sought warrants, I should say, or rulings against Israel and its leaders.
Well, I think we have to start by the assumption that U.S. policy has not changed. The very extremist positions that then President Trump took when he went to Israel in 2018 and announced that he was moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Jerusalem as the so-called capital of Israel, recognizing the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights as somehow a legal annexation, saying that annexation of the West Bank would be fine. All of these very extremist positions were announced and criticized and rejected by then candidate Joe Biden. When Biden came into office, he said, I don't agree with these policies. These are not what I agree with, which, again, I think is probably true, but profoundly irrelevant, again, because he did nothing to change those policies. So
does that mean it won't change going forward, depending on who makes it back into the White House?
I think that what has changed is the political pressure. Since that time, the only thing that Biden changed, and he has since reversed that, was he did start funding UNRWA again, but then stopped it again. The question with Kamala Harris, after, we have still 5 more months with Biden as president, so this isn't just about the election. This is about what people in power, the president and the vice president, do as president and vice president, not just about whatever they do on the electoral arena. As president and vice president, they have not changed the policy of providing Israel with massive amounts of money. It's not just now the usual $3.8 billion every year that they send directly to the Israeli military every year, which amounts to about 20% of the entire budget of the IDF. But it now has gone up to $17 billion this year, with another $10 billion that's already been authorized for these massive escalations in giant bombs, in tank ammunition, in drones, in planes, in all of the equipment that is enabling genocide. Right. The question of whether it's going to change in reality to match the change in tone is going to be very much up to what Kamala Harris thinks she has to do as a candidate to respond to the needs and demands of people in the Democratic Party. And more urgently, for the next 5 months, what is President Biden going to do in response to the uncommitted movement, the protests that have been going on, the demands of his own party that are saying 70% of people want to stop, public pressure specifically to stop sending arms.
All right, we're afraid we have to also stop the show at this point. Let's thank our guests, though, Phyllis Bennis, Gideon Levy, and Niall Stanage. And thank you for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.